When we talk about Breath of the Wild, we always come back to that same central question. What did it cost the Zelda franchise? In the pursuit of unlimited player freedom, we lost calculated dungeon design and the feeling of progression that comes with acquiring new tools and equipment throughout your journey. A fully explorable open world means a narrative that can be discovered in bits and pieces in any order, which can lead to a disconnect from the overarching plot. Some people think that we should go back to the old style of Zelda games, more linear, more dungeons in general, and some people think that Breath of the Wild's new convention is the future for the franchise, and taking a step backwards would be a mistake. But what if both sides of this debate are actually right? And what if this rumored Ocarina of Time remake, which is supposedly launching at the end of the year for Switch 2, is actually the perfect proving ground for Zelda to find out what the future really can be? Ocarina of Time launched for the Nintendo 64 in 1998 and was immediately hailed as an all-timer. It was a classic, day one classic. While A Link to the Past is generally considered the blueprint for all Zelda games going forwards, Ocarina of Time took that blueprint and transitioned it into 3D, and even compared to other games coming out on the N64 at the time, it was leaps and bounds ahead of everything else on the market. Even now, Ocarina of Time holds a very special place in the entirety of the franchise, and a lot of that has to do with the N64's limitations hardware-wise. Ocarina has this mythical quality that none of the other games really have. It feels like you're playing through a legend. So much of that is due to Hyrule needing to be shrunk down to fit on an N64 cartridge. You can't just constantly have cutscenes and dialogue explaining everything that's happening. This leaves players room to fill in the gaps themselves, to create their own headcanon. Hyrule Field is pretty sparse in the game, but players imagine it to be much bigger than it actually is. Traveling through Hyrule Field to get to all the different places you need to go kind of implies a journey more than it actually is a literal one. In future games in the franchise and on more powerful hardware, spaces like Hyrule Field become actual size, and there's more of a focus on cutscenes and cinematics. The storytelling and the play space itself becomes more literal, and that's one of the things that I think makes Ocarina of Time stand out even today. The first remake of Ocarina of Time came out in June of 2011 for the Nintendo 3DS. It was Ocarina of Time 3D. It was actually my first way of playing through the game in its entirety, and even then, I found that mythical quality of Ocarina of Time was completely intact. Yes, there are a lot of little changes here and there to Ocarina of Time 3D. There are a lot of quality of life improvements. They use the bottom screen to allow you to manage your inventory. There's a lot of great stuff that they've done to just kind of ease the process of playing Ocarina of Time. Take out some of the more archaic 1998 bits. But for the most part, that game is just a texture pack. It's a pretty high-res version of Ocarina of Time. All of the spaces are exactly as big as they were, but, it just looks better. Well, better is subjective, but you get what I mean. Some people would think it looks better. I'm one of those people. The thing about Ocarina of Time 3D is that it came out at a time where the 3DS really needed to prove itself. The Nintendo DS, still one of the best-selling consoles of all time. It was a huge deal when the Nintendo DS came out. And when the 3DS was released, there were a lot of people who were on the fence about it. A lot of hardcore fans weren't sure if it was worth upgrading to this 3DS. It was expensive and it wasn't selling as well as Nintendo wanted, but a couple months into its life cycle, we got Ocarina of Time 3D, which to me really looks like this legitimizing force for the 3DS. A lot of people thought of the Nintendo DS as a dual-screened N64 that was handheld. A lot of people thought of the Game Boy Advance as a Super Nintendo that was handheld. What better way of proving this leap of power for the Nintendo 3DS than to take this N64 game that hypothetically they could have probably ported to the Nintendo DS, but make it look leaps and bounds better. Even then, this was a really risky thing to do. A lot of people questioned the need for a remake of Ocarina of Time, but when it came out, it was a hit. I think so much of the reason it was successful, though, is because it kept that mythical je ne sais quoi intact. Meanwhile, on the Nintendo Wii, a couple months later, we get Skyward Sword, which is not so well received by fans. It's not the first time a game wasn't super well received by fans. Back in the year 2000, Nintendo had an event called Space World, where they showed off this demo of what the GameCube could do from a power perspective. This demo reel features a bunch of Pokemon running around, Meowth with a guitar for some reason, Samus running through a hallway away from aliens, and, crucially, Link and Ganondorf fighting one another in a very cinematic Ocarina of Time adjacent battle. This demo became a huge deal, almost infamous basically immediately, and a lot of outlets started asking Nintendo questions about are you remaking Ocarina of Time for the GameCube? Is this a game that's actually in development? Are you making a sequel to Ocarina of Time for the GameCube? And obviously radio silence until Wind Waker. Wind Waker now is considered one of the best games in the Zelda franchise, but at the time, people thought of it as a rug pull. I think fans were so poisoned by their own expectations having watched this Space World demo that Nintendo didn't even confirm or deny was a real video game, that when Wind Waker came out and had this like cartoony kiddie art style, they just kind of rejected it immediately. So after this weirdly middling reaction to Wind Waker, Nintendo decided to correct course and give players the more mature take on Zelda that they had apparently been asking for. This manifested as Twilight Princess, which was my first Zelda game that I played all the way through. I got a Nintendo Wii on launch day and played that game and absolutely loved it, mainly because it's like the most emo Zelda game that exists. I was an angsty freshman in high school when that game came out. I was listening to My Chemical Romance on my iPod. I like Twilight Princess a lot. I still do. I think it's really good. But Twilight Princess is important to this conversation because it's kind of a remake of Ocarina of Time. It takes place in the same timeline, a couple hundred years after or so. You're visiting a lot of the same places. Hyrule Field is the size that Hyrule Field should be. Players finally got their more mature take on Zelda. And not only that, but they got Ocarina of Time again. That's the thing everybody had been asking for. And at launch, Twilight Princess garnered a more positive critical and audience reaction than Wind Waker did. Although these days, if I was to do a temperature check, I feel like Twilight Princess has kind of fallen out of favor. It's seen as mostly derivative, sometimes because of its relation to Ocarina of Time. A lot of people say, why not just go play Ocarina of Time again? So then you get Skyward Sword, a pretty maligned video game with a great soundtrack. And after that, buddy, it's Breath of the Wild. Breath of the Wild is a masterpiece. There's no getting around masterpiece status for Breath of the Wild. It redefined open world gameplay for the entire industry, and it also redefined what a Zelda game could be. There was a pre and post Link to the Past era of Zelda, and now there's a pre and post Breath of the Wild era. So why, with all of these positive changes, do we still have a contingent of players who are desperate for that older format of game? That all of these games that led up to Skyward Sword are actually the preferable version of this franchise? The easy answer is obviously subjective taste. Some people like some things, some people like other things. Could you imagine if that was the whole video? It was all just leading up to that idea. Subjectivity exists. Wouldn't that be funny? Like, comment, subscribe. Thanks for watching. No, a big part of where those preferences come from in the first place is all about what Breath of the Wild gave up to achieve what it did. As an open world game, Breath of the Wild wants to provide its players with the most freedom possible. So if you want to go to Hyrule Castle right after the tutorial wraps up, go for it. You want to climb up every tower and unlock the whole map first? Sure. Go find Koroks? Sure. Find all the little narrative bits and bobs hiding around the world? Sure. You could do any of it. You could do all of it in any order you want. Everything is open and everything is available from the jump, which presents a bunch of confusing game design questions, which are basically all answered the same way. Just give everyone all the tools they need right at the beginning of the video game. No longer will you be traversing the world, spelunking into dungeons, coming out with like a hook shot, which will allow you to get to another place later in the video game. No, you just are given all of the tools you need on the Sheikah slate right at the beginning of the video game in the Great Plateau, which means that as you actually do venture out into the world of Hyrule, any challenge you come across, you know you already have the means of solving that problem for yourself. This means that instead of like discrete dungeons, we're getting the divine beasts or shrines or whatever, and in both of those cases, you are just completely eschewing the standard dungeon design that Zelda had kind of become known for at that point. The idea of going into a dungeon, unlocking a new tool or piece of equipment, having the dungeon challenge you with creative ways of using that tool or equipment over and over and over again until a boss fight, which is like the ultimate test of do you get it, and then leaving, it's a rewarding experience. It feels like progression. And in the very best Zelda games, those tools are then used out in the overworld. That's why I like Twilight Princess so much. They're always asking you to use the things that you got inside a dungeon. But getting rid of dungeons entirely, that's a decision I can get behind because it's a huge swing. It's a really big question to ask. If people define Zelda by its dungeon design, getting rid of them asks new questions and forces us to ask new questions about what Zelda games can be. Simultaneously, that's the kind of decision that ruptures the fan base, cleaves it right in half. So after Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, there is this danger of stagnation once again. You could run into the Skyward Sword problem where we've done the same thing twice now. Are you really going to ask us to do it for a third time? How do you continue iterating on this formula without it getting stale again? And is the answer to go backwards in time? I don't think you make Ocarina of Time again on the Nintendo Switch 2 as just another remaster. If Nintendo's goal was to just give people Ocarina of Time on the Nintendo Switch 2, well, first of all, it's already there on the N64 in the Nintendo Online subscription, but also you could just port the 3DS version at any time. The 3DS version of Ocarina of Time on the Nintendo Switch 2 do up the textures a little bit, make it look a little bit nicer, you know, the way like texture packs do for the people who are emulating it. Solid video game. People would probably be very happy with that, if I'm being honest. But no, I feel like there's got to be another reason at play here. And this isn't a question of like, will it be a faithful remake or should this even exist? This is more of a question of like, how should it exist? If it's gonna exist, how do you make it work? I think the reason you remake Ocarina of Time for the Switch 2, beyond just selling more Switch 2 units, obviously line must continue to go up, is to prove that this new format of Zelda post Breath of the Wild can actually be applied to a more classic linear Zelda structure. While I appreciate this high degree of freedom that Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom provide, I think there's power in more structure, a linear story that you get invested in over time. I think there's power in more tightly designed dungeons. I think there's power in going into those dungeons and finding a new tool that leads to the feeling of progression in that it allows you to explore the world in new ways. Importantly, none of that precludes the game from having an open world. While these two sides of the franchise are frequently discussed as being opposing, I actually think there's harmony in blending the two of them together. And Ocarina of Time is actually the perfect game to prove that with. A version of Ocarina of Time that follows the beats of the story but doesn't shrink its world down is a version of Ocarina of Time that opens up infinite possibilities for players. The original game already featured a bunch of side quests and optional activities that you could do. There's no reason that a remake couldn't amp that up to another level. If Hyrule Field and all of Hyrule itself expanded to become its actual size, there's no telling what kinds of mysteries and characters you could run into along the way. There was and are a bunch of benefits to the more liminal vibe of the N64 and 3DS versions of the game, but I see a remake as a way for Nintendo to kind of flex its design muscles and find a happy medium that pleases both sides of the fan base. It's a game where we can spend our time traveling between true, discrete dungeons that give us tools that allow us to explore even more of Hyrule over time. All we're doing is taking the Breath of the Wild approach of giving you all the tools at the beginning and saying, what if you got those tools over time, and getting those tools over time allowed you to explore more of Hyrule? It doesn't make the game completely linear. It's still an open world, but getting new tools from dungeons allows you to explore more of that world. Think about how great that feeling is of seeing a bunch of rocks that you know you'll be able to bomb in the future and then eventually getting the bomb bag. Now imagine a version of the game where bombing those rocks doubled the size of the explorable space in Hyrule. How cool would that be? I don't see the potential of this rumored remake as just another 4K graphics update of an old classic. I see it as a playground. I see it as a place for Nintendo to figure out what the future of Zelda can be. And this isn't the first time Nintendo's done this. On the 3DS, we got A Link Between Worlds after Skyward Sword. Skyward Sword was dunked on for being too linear and too derivative and too wordy, and A Link Between Worlds was like, all right, man, we'll open the pit. Go rent a bow. Go rent the hookshot. Go do the hookshot dungeon whenever you want. It's one of the reasons Link Between Worlds is probably my favorite Zelda game. It's a coin flip between that and Breath of the Wild, I think, on any given day. The point is, there's precedent for Nintendo to use a Zelda game as an experimental playground to figure out what the future of Zelda can be. And yes, using Ocarina of Time as an experimental playground is definitely risky, but hey, if it doesn't pan out, the original is right there. I think in this hypothetical mishmash of the open world formula and the more linear formula, you don't really lose the DNA that makes Breath of the Wild Breath of the Wild. In fact, I really think you're using the best of both formats. Ocarina of Time is kind of a tried and true classic, but all Breath of the Wild's formula adds to that tried and true classic is expanding the space between story beats. And that space in between story beats is where adventure lives. That's where the journey really becomes the journey. The headcanon and the imagination that you used in the original Ocarina of Time doesn't get lost in this case. It just gets replaced with actual exploration. This is maybe a left field example, but I think it makes sense. When I think back on my experience playing Shadow of the Colossus on the PS2, I don't really think of the Colossi that much. Like when I close my eyes and I think about my experience playing Shadow of the Colossus, I think about riding my horse in between the boss fights. I think about like stopping to collect a lizard. Is that a thing you did in that game? You collected lizards? I think you collect lizards in that game. Is that how you upgrade your stamina? Same stamina thing that you got in Breath of the Wild, huh? That's interesting. What was I talking about? The journey, yes. Shadow of the Colossus is incredible at creating a sense of adventure because that space in between the bosses is just as important as the boss fights themselves. Shadow of the Colossus has a very loose story, kind of like Ocarina of Time. It's basically loose enough that you can kind of impart your own emotion onto it. It's a very emotional story because of how little there is. What I'm envisioning here is a version of Ocarina of Time that puts as much emphasis on the space between spaces as it does on the spaces themselves. And so much of that can be pulled directly from what makes Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom work. The space between spaces is where the best adventure stories live, which is how these two structures can combine to form one cohesive whole that elevates the craft entirely. Ideally, the Ocarina of Time remake becomes a great game within itself, while also providing a blueprint for everything that comes after. Thank you so much for watching this one. Let me know if my hope for Ocarina of Time is completely delusional, and head over to patreon.com/wavelengths if you want to watch me play the opening of the original Ocarina of Time and a bunch of other stuff. Bye-bye.